They had said goodbye before they surrendered. Not out loud, there was no time for that and no one to say it to. But in the last minutes before they walked out with their hands up, each of them had done it privately, in whatever way a man says goodbye to everything at once. They had heard the stories. Every soldier had heard the stories. What happened to men who surrendered in the final weeks when the war was already lost and the victors had nothing left to prove except that they had won? The stories were specific. They were told in whispers. Nobody questioned them because nobody had come back to say they were wrong. So they walked out of the tree line with their hands above their heads, and they kept walking, and they did not look at each other, because looking at each other would have made it real in a way they were not ready for. The American soldiers on the other side stopped. Rifles came up. The field between the two groups went completely still. This was it. Then the sergeant raised one hand. The rifles went down. He walked across the field toward them, alone. No weapon raised. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the men in front of him. Coats torn, faces hollow, hands still above their heads, some of them shaking without realizing it. He said something in English. The translator beside him repeated it in German. It was not what any of them expected. He said, "You can put your hands down now." Nobody moved. Not because they were defiant, because they didn't know what to do with a sentence like that. There were 9 of them. What remained of a signals unit that had been retreating for 3 weeks through the collapsed Western Front, losing men to artillery and cold, and the simple mathematics of a war that had run out of everything except distance to cover. Their officer had been killed 4 days earlier. The man who had been making decisions since then was a corporal named Ritter, 32 years old, a former postal worker from Düsseldorf, a man who had spent the last 4 years doing things he had never imagined doing and was very tired. It was Ritter who had made the decision to surrender. Not dramatically, he had simply stopped walking east one morning and sat down against a tree and told the others that this was as far as he was going. 2 of them had argued. Then they had stopped arguing and sat down too. By the time dawn came, all 9 of them had agreed on the same thing without needing to say it directly. They would walk toward the American lines, and whatever happened would happen. Ritter had spent the night before making his private goodbye. He had thought about his mother. He had thought about his apartment in Düsseldorf and the particular sound the tram made at 6 in the morning. He had thought about a woman he had known before the war, whose name he had been carrying for 4 years without knowing what to do with it. He had thought about all of these things until they felt complete, and then he had stopped thinking and waited for morning. Now he was standing in a field with his hands at his sides. The sergeant had said, "Put them down," and eventually he had put them down and he was alive, and a translator was explaining to him what would happen next. Processing, the translator said. Medical check, assignment to a holding facility. The sergeant would escort them. Ritter looked at the sergeant. The sergeant was a large man in his 30s with the unhurried expression of someone who has done this before and found it unremarkable. He was not looking at the Germans with hatred or triumph or any of the things Ritter had been prepared for. He was looking at his clipboard. Ritter said through the translator, "What happens to us now?" The sergeant said, without looking up, "You get processed. Then you go to a camp." Ritter said, "And then?" The sergeant looked up. He looked at Ritter for a moment. He said, "And then the war ends and you go home." Ritter had no response to this. He stood in the field and looked at the sergeant and tried to find the lie inside the sentence and could not find it. They walked for 2 hours to reach the processing point, a converted farmhouse on a road that had seen better years. The Americans moved alongside them, not behind them with rifles raised but alongside, the way people walk when they are going to the same place and there is no particular hurry. One of the younger American soldiers, barely 20, with the face of someone who had not yet finished growing into it, walked near the back of the group. At some point he reached into his coat and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. He held it out toward the nearest German without looking at him directly, the way you offer something when you're not sure it will be accepted and don't want to make it into a thing either way. The German looked at the cigarettes. He looked at the American. He took one. The American lit it for him and put the pack back in his pocket and kept walking. Nobody said anything. But something shifted in the way the group moved after that. Something small and difficult to name, a slight loosening of the specific tension that had been there since the tree line. The processing point was busy. There were other prisoners already there, from different units, all of them wearing the same expression, the expression of men who had arrived somewhere they did not expect to arrive and were still working out what that meant. American soldiers moved between them with clipboards and medical kits and occasional cups of something hot. A medic came to look at the 9 men from Ritter's group. He worked through them quickly and practically, checking for wounds, asking questions through the translator, making notes. When he reached one of the younger soldiers, a boy of 19 who had been limping since the day before, saying nothing about it, the medic crouched down and looked at his boot. He unlaced it. The boy flinched. The medic looked at the foot inside, made a quiet sound of professional assessment, and said something to a colleague who brought supplies. He treated the foot. It took 20 minutes. The boy sat on the ground and watched an American medic work on his foot with the same focused care he would have given any patient, and he did not say anything, and his face did not show what he was thinking. Ritter watched from nearby. He had been a postal worker. He had delivered letters to strangers for years, had knocked on doors and handed over envelopes and moved on, and he had understood that job as something small and invisible, the kind of work that holds the world together without anyone noticing it. He had not expected to think about it here. But watching the medic wrap the boy's foot, he thought about it, about the idea of work done carefully for its own sake, without an audience, without a reason beyond the fact that it needed doing. He did not know what to do with this thought. He filed it away. That evening they were moved to a holding facility, a camp of wooden barracks behind wire on the edge of a town. They were assigned bunks. They were given food, plain, warm, more than Ritter had eaten in a week. They were given a schedule for the next day. Ritter sat on the edge of his bunk and looked at the schedule: mealtime, work assignment, evening count, a Sunday rest hour. He looked at the bunk. The mattress was thin, but it was a mattress. The blanket at the foot was folded with the precision of someone who had been trained to fold blankets and had done it so many times it had become automatic. Someone had made this bunk. Someone had thought about who would sleep in it. He lay down. He looked at the ceiling. He thought about the morning, the field, the sergeant's hand going up, the rifles going down, the sentence that had made no sense: "You can put your hands down now." He thought about the cigarette offered without looking, about the medic and the boy's foot, about the bunk and the blanket and the schedule on the wall. He had spent the night before his surrender making his goodbye. He had been thorough about it. He had covered everything. He had not covered this. He did not know what this was exactly. It was not safety. The wire was real. The guards were real. The fact of being a prisoner was real and would remain real until it wasn't. It was not kindness in any form he had a name for, because the word kindness had always implied something personal, something given from one person to another, and what had happened today had not felt personal. It had felt procedural, organized, the way a system works when the system has decided that certain things are simply how things are done. He tried to find the word for it and could not. He thought, "I came here to die." That was the plan. That was what the stories had prepared me for. That was what I said goodbye in advance of all. He thought, they did not follow the plan. He thought, I do not know what to do with that yet. He closed his eyes. The bunk was thin, but it held him. The blanket was rough, but it was warm. Outside, the camp settled into its nighttime routine. The sound of boots on gravel, a distant voice, the small sounds of a place that intended to keep functioning until morning. In the morning, Ritter would eat breakfast. He would go to a work assignment. He would come back. He would eat dinner. He would sleep. He would do this again the next day. And somewhere in the repetition of ordinary days, in the rhythm of a place that treated him as something worth maintaining, the goodbye he had made so carefully the night before surrender would slowly, without announcement, become unnecessary. He did not know this yet. He was only at the beginning of it. But the ceiling above him was solid, and the bunk beneath him held, and outside the window the sky was beginning to lighten, and he was still here. That was enough for now.